March 7th, 1944, 3:47 a.m., private first class. Hans Schmidt opened his eyes. The pain in his left leg was so intense that his first instinct was to slip back into unconsciousness. But then he heard it. The deep, mechanical rumble. Tanks, hundreds of them. He could feel the vibrations through the frozen ground beneath him. The Soviet offensive had begun, and his comrades, 29 miles west in Kovel, had no idea that in less than 18 hours, a wave of an estimated 400 T-34 tanks would be rolling over their position. Schmidt knew three things with absolute certainty in that moment. First, his reconnaissance patrol was dead, ambushed by a Soviet machine gun nest they hadn't anticipated. Second, the bullet that had shattered his femur had narrowly missed his main artery. Otherwise, he would already have bled out. And third, only he could warn them. The radio equipment was destroyed. Their only vehicle, a utility vehicle, was still burning 50 meters away, and the nearest German outpost was at least 125 miles away, through Soviet-controlled territory, with a shattered leg in the dead of the Eastern Front winter, where the temperature had plummeted to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit the night before. Medically speaking, Schmidt had no chance, but camaraderie knows no medical boundaries. Let me tell you about the man who achieved the impossible, not because he was superhuman, but because he understood what soldiers everywhere understand. The man next to you is more important than your own life. Schmidt was 24 years old. Before the war, he was a forester in Bavaria. He knew forests, knew winters, knew how to survive when nature wanted you dead, but nothing in the Bavarian Alps had prepared him for the Eastern Front. For 8 months, he had been fighting with the 291st Infantry Division. They were no elite unit, no paratroopers, no tank aces. Just ordinary men, trying to survive in a place where the average life expectancy at the front was 3 weeks. Schmidt was a survivor, cautious, methodical, the kind of soldier who kept his comrades alive by thinking twice before acting. His reconnaissance patrol on March 6 was supposed to be routine. 4 men, 5 miles east of their lines, observing Soviet movements. But the Red Army had changed something in recent weeks. The usual patterns were gone. Radio traffic was silent. It was as if the enemy was holding its breath. Schmidt had reported it to his commanding officer. Captain Werner Dietrich had nodded, taken notes. But like so many other German officers in the spring of 1944, he was too busy with 100 other crises to pay attention to another vague warning. The patrol on March 6th had run into an ambush. Sergeant Klaus Bauer, Schmidt's best friend since basic training, was killed instantly. A headshot. Private Werner Stein, 19 years old, had tried to return fire and had been riddled by machine gun fire. Private Otto Braun had made it to the utility vehicle before a bazooka round, originally intended for German troops but captured by the Soviets, turned the vehicle into a fireball. Schmidt had seen the machine gun nest a second before it opened fire. He had jumped, rolled, taken cover behind a fallen tree, but not fast enough. The 7.62mm bullet had hit his left thigh, passing cleanly through the femur before exiting on the other side. The shock had been so intense that he couldn't scream for 5 seconds. Then adrenaline had kicked in. He had dragged himself 200 meters through the snow, while Soviet voices grew closer behind him. They were searching for survivors. He had hidden under a pile of fallen branches, covered in snow, holding his breath as boots passed 10 feet from his head. They hadn't found him. And then night had fallen. And with it, the realization of what he had heard before the ambush began. Tanks, not a dozen, hundreds, all night. Schmidt could hear them, massing 7 miles to the east. The distinctive diesel rumble of the T-34s, the metallic screech of tracks on frozen mud, Soviet officers shouting orders. This was no ordinary patrol movement. This was an offensive, a massive one, and it was aimed directly at Kovel, where the 291st Division, along with two other heavily depleted units, formed the only line of defense between the Red Army and the strategic railway junction. If Kovel fell, the entire southern front would collapse. 40,000 German soldiers would be cut off. The disaster would make Stalingrad look like a minor skirmish, and no one knew the attack was coming. The patrol's radio was destroyed. The Soviets had shot down all German reconnaissance flights in recent days. The Red Army had mastered something they would later call maskirovka, strategic deception on a level the German military had never seen before, and Hans Schmidt, a simple private first class with a shattered leg and no equipment other than his uniform and a field knife, was the only person in the world who knew what was going to happen in less than a day. The temptation to die was overwhelming. The blood loss alone should have been enough. The cold would do the rest. Freezing to death, older soldiers had told him, wasn't the worst way to go. After a while, you just feel sleepy. You fall asleep. You don't wake up. It would have been so easy. But then Schmidt thought of Captain Dietrich, of Sergeant Zimmermann, who had taught him how to survive in the Eastern Front winter, of the machine gun squad of Heinz and Ludwig, who always shared their cigarettes with him, even though he never had any, of the young medic, Paul Richter, who constantly talked about his girlfriend back in Dresden, of 3,000 men, who had no idea their world was about to explode in 18 hours. And Schmidt did what German soldiers on the Eastern Front did when everything seemed hopeless. He started to work. First, he tore strips from his undershirt and made a pressure bandage for his leg. The bleeding had slowed, but every movement reopened the wound. He needed a splint. 15 minutes of crawling through the snow brought him to a young birch tree. With his field knife, he cut off two 2-foot-long branches. With more strips of fabric, he tied them to either side of his leg. The pain as he tightened the splint made him pass out. When he came to, it was 5:30 a.m. The sun would rise soon, and Soviet patrols would be scouring the area. The first 3 miles were hell. PFC Schmidt couldn't stand. His leg wouldn't support his weight. So he crawled, on his elbows and right knee, dragging his shattered left leg behind him. He crawled through snow, sometimes 1.5 feet deep. He crawled over frozen mud that clung to his uniform, making it heavier. He crawled around corpses, German and Soviet, remnants of earlier battles, preserved by the winter, every 100 yards. He had to stop. The pain from his leg was like white-hot metal, branded directly into his brain. His fingers, even in gloves, went numb. His face lost all feeling, but he kept crawling. After 4 hours and 3 miles, Schmidt found something that saved his life, an abandoned Soviet supply depot, probably a temporary position, abandoned as the front moved. There, he found a broken wooden sled, the kind Soviet troops used to transport ammunition, and Schmidt, the lumberjack from Bavaria, who knew how to improvise long before the German military taught him, had an idea. With his field knife, he cut off one of the runners, then whittled the wood until he had a crude walking stick. He wrapped fabric around the top for padding. It was primitive. It was barely more than a stick, but it meant he could stand. And if he could stand, he could walk. Slowly, painfully, every step a new testament to his will. But he could move. By the evening of March 7th, after 15 hours of movement, Schmidt had covered 14 miles. In that time, he'd seen Soviet patrols twice and successfully hidden both times. Once, when he couldn't find cover, he'd laid flat in the snow, his body as still as the fallen soldiers around him, and prayed they'd mistake him for another corpse. They had, But the price was high. His leg was now severely infected. He could see the red lines creeping up his thigh from the wound. Blood poisoning, sepsis. He knew the signs. He'd seen enough men die from it. His body temperature soared. Chills shook him so violently, he had to clench his teeth to keep from screaming. And the hallucinations began. At first, they were small, shadows at the edge of his vision that disappeared when he looked directly at them. But as night fell and the temperature plummeted to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, they became more intense. He saw Mike Bauer, his dead friend, walking beside him. Mike talked to him, cracked jokes like in the old days. Schmidt knew it wasn't real, but the part of his brain, starved of oxygen and riddled with infection, wanted to believe. He spoke back, and Mike, the hallucination, kept him going. The night of March 7th should have killed Schmidt. The combination of blood poisoning, hypothermia, and exhaustion was medically lethal. Military doctors would later say his survival defied the laws of physiology, but Schmidt had an advantage that no medical science could measure: purpose. He'd stopped thinking about himself, his pain, his chances of survival, his future. All had become irrelevant. There was only one thought in his head: Koval, the Comrades, the warning. Everything else was noise. That absolute concentration did something to his physiology. His body, which should have given up, found reserves that medicine doesn't know about. Stress hormones flooded his system, keeping him awake when he should have collapsed. His body began to consume muscle tissue as fuel when no other energy sources remained. He became a biological machine with a single program: move, warn, survive long enough to deliver the message, then you can die. On the morning of March 8th, Schmidt found an abandoned Ukrainian farmhouse. The family had fled, or worse. He found 2 potatoes in a cellar, half rotten but edible. He devoured them raw. He found an old coat, riddled with shrapnel but warm enough. And critically, he found vodka, half a bottle, probably moonshine. Schmidt knew what he had to do. He took a long swig for the pain, then he poured the rest directly over the wound in his leg. The pain was so extreme, he collapsed. For 3 minutes, he lay on the farmhouse floor, screaming. But alcohol, even cheap vodka, was a disinfectant. It wouldn't cure the infection, but it might slow it down. Enough to buy him maybe one more day. One day was all he needed. As he lay in the farmhouse, waiting for the wave of pain to subside, Schmidt thought about time. It was now 8:30 a.m. on March 8th. The offensive would likely begin at dawn on March 9th. That gave him about 20 hours, and he still had at least 105 miles to go. Mathematically impossible. Even a healthy soldier would need 2 full days of marching to cover that distance. He, with his shattered leg, with his blood poisoning, with nothing but a makeshift stick. The numbers said it couldn't be done. But Schmidt had stopped listening to numbers. He left the farmhouse at 9 a.m. and resumed his march. And then something remarkable happened. His body began to adapt. The pain, which had been unbearable on the first day, became a constant, dull roar. His brain had learned to filter it out, not eliminate, ignore. He developed a rhythm: stick forward, right leg, drag left leg, stick, right, left, over and over, mechanically, automatically. Hour after hour, the rhythm became a meditation: stick, right, left. Mike was still walking beside him, the hallucination now his constant companion. They didn't talk anymore. Mike was just there, a presence, a witness, proof that Schmidt was still sane, at least partially. On the afternoon of March 8th, after covering another 22 miles, Schmidt encountered his greatest danger since the ambush: a Soviet checkpoint, 4 men, a roadblock. A road he had to cross. There was no alternative route. Dense woods on either side that would take hours to traverse, hours he didn't have. He had to get past them. Schmidt watched the checkpoint for an hour. The Soviets weren't particularly vigilant. Why should they be? They were 25 miles behind their own lines. No German force could possibly be here. PFC Schmidt waited until 7 p.m. Dusk, the most dangerous time, when eyes play tricks. And shadows could be men, or couldn't be. He had one advantage. His scavenged Soviet coat in the fading light. From a distance, if he hobbled like a wounded Red Army soldier, he might just get through. It was a gamble with his life. But everything was a gamble at this point. He stepped out of the woods, 200 yards from the checkpoint, onto the road. He moved slowly, obviously wounded. One of the Soviet guards spotted him, shouted something in Russian. Schmidt raised a hand, weakly, the universal gesture of an injured man needing help. 2 guards started walking towards him. Schmidt forced himself onward, his heart hammered so loudly he was sure they could hear it. 100 yards. The guards came closer, 50 yards. They shouted again. Schmidt didn't answer, didn't speak Russian, hoping that silence would be interpreted as shock. 30 yards. Now he could see their faces. Young men, no older than himself. One of the guards raised his PPH-41 submachine gun, not aiming, just cautious. And then, rescue came from the most unlikely source. A Soviet officer emerged from the guardhouse and roared at the guards. Schmidt didn't understand a word, but the tone was universal. "Back to your posts, you idiots. We don't have time for every wounded stray." The guards reluctantly turned around and went back to the checkpoint. Schmidt forced himself to maintain his pace, slow. Hobbling, just another wounded Soviet soldier. Stumbling back to a field hospital, he walked past the checkpoint, 50 yards beyond it, 100 yards. No one called out. 200 yards. Still nothing. At 300 yards, Schmidt allowed himself to believe he'd made it. He looked back. The guards no longer cared about him. And Schmidt vanished back into the woods, his legs shaking so violently from adrenaline that he had to lean against a tree to keep from falling. He had just walked through a Soviet security post, with a German uniform under a captured coat, with a shattered leg that would have identified him as an enemy, if anyone had looked closely. The audacity, the sheer impossible audacity of it, hit him. And for the first time since Kyle had died, Schmidt laughed. A short, almost silent laugh. Hysterical around the edges, but genuine. Then he started walking again. Cane. Right. Left. The night of March 8th, turning into the 9th, was the longest of Schmidt's life. The temperature plummeted to 31 degrees Fahrenheit. His wet coat, soaked with sweat from his feverish march, began to freeze. Ice crystals formed in his beard. His eyelashes froze together. He had to stop every few minutes to break them apart with his fingers. The sepsis had now taken over his entire system. His leg was swollen to twice its size. The skin around the wound was black. The smell, which he couldn't ignore, was the smell of rotting flesh, gangrene. His leg was dying, and unless it was amputated soon, very soon, the rest of him would follow. But amputation required a doctor, and doctors were in Kovel, where he was headed. So it was okay. He would make it in time. He had to. The hallucinations were getting worse. Kyle wasn't alone now. The entire dead patrol was marching with him. Baker, Stone, Brown. They talked, joked, reminded Schmidt of better times. Schmidt knew they weren't real, but he was grateful for the company. Marching in the Eastern Front night with ghosts was better than marching alone. At 2 a.m. on March 9th, Schmidt collapsed. His body simply refused to take another step. He lay in the snow, his breathing shallow, his heart slowing. This was it. The end. He had made it 112 miles, 12 more miles to go. So close, but his body had no reserves left. He closed his eyes. Death would be a relief, and then he heard it, distant, barely more than an echo on the wind, but unmistakable. German machine gun fire, the distinctive roar of the MG-42. The buzz saw, as the soldiers called it, 200 rounds per minute, a sound that no other weapon in the world could reproduce. German lines, somewhere ahead of him, maybe 3 miles, maybe 6. But there, Schmidt opened his eyes, forced his hands to move, pushed himself into a sitting position, found his cane, stood on legs that shouldn't have been, and started walking again. Cane, right, left. The morning of March 9th broke at 6:15 a.m. The sun rose over the frozen landscape, and Schmidt saw something that almost made him weep. Barbed wire, trenches, the unmistakable pattern of German defensive positions. He had made it. But there was a problem. He was approaching German lines from the wrong side, from the east. From enemy-held territory, every German sentry would shoot first and ask questions later, especially now. In the morning twilight, the classic time for attacks. Schmidt had to get it right. He had to be identified. Before some nervous guard shot him, he stopped 300 yards from the trenches, took a deep breath, and shouted in a voice that was barely more than a croak after 3 days without proper liquid, not halt, not identify yourself. He shouted the one word that every German soldier would know, the word that meant the most to comrades at war. He shouted, Heimat! And then, louder, Kameraden! And loudest of all, using the last reserves of his voice, attack coming! Warn Kovel! In the German trenches 300 yards away, Private First Class Ludwig Hartmann heard a shout. He raised his binoculars, saw a figure, a man, German uniform. Impossible. No one was out there. No man's land was empty. Hartmann called for his platoon leader, Lieutenant Fischer. Fischer looked through his own binoculars, saw the man who was now waving weakly, desperately, and then, even at that distance, Fischer saw that the man could barely stand. A survivor? From what unit? Fischer ordered 2 men to go out. Carefully, weapons ready, in case it was a trap. But when PFC Weber and Rifleman Klein reached Schmidt, they knew immediately that this was no trap. The man could barely stand. His left leg was swollen and black. His face was grey with blood loss. His breath smelled of infection, and his eyes burned with an intensity that both men would never forget. Weber reached for Schmidt to support him, and Schmidt, with the last milligrams of his strength, grabbed Weber by the collar and pulled him close, speaking directly into his ear. Each word cost him almost his last reserves. Tanks. Offensive. Hundreds. This morning, Kovel must warn them. And then Hans Schmidt collapsed in Weber's arms, his consciousness finally shutting down after pushing his body past every human limit for 3 days and 200 kilometers. He woke up in the field hospital. 12 hours later, a doctor, Captain Dr. Richter, sat beside his bed. As Schmidt opened his eyes, Richter smiled, a sad smile. "We had to amputate your leg," Richter said, "below the knee. The gangrene had spread too far." "I'm sorry," Schmidt nodded. Richter asked with a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Kovel, did they warn them?" Richter's smile became less sad. "They sent the message to division headquarters within 30 minutes. Captain Dietrich diverted 3 tank companies and 2 artillery batteries to reinforce Kovel. When the Soviet offensive began at 09:00 this morning, we were ready. You saved 3,000 lives. Private first class, maybe more. Schmidt closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, and Dr. Richter, a man who had seen hundreds of soldiers die and thought nothing could move him anymore, had to look away, so Schmidt wouldn't see the tears in his eyes. What Dr. Richter didn't say, because he didn't want Schmidt to feel guilty, was the complete medical reality. Schmidt's march should not only have been medically impossible, it should have been physiologically incompatible with known science. Richter had documented every aspect of Schmidt's condition in the last 12 hours. The wound in his femur had missed the femoral artery by less than 3 millimeters. 3 millimeters between life and bleeding out in minutes. The sepsis in his blood was so advanced that Richter didn't understand how Schmidt had remained conscious, let alone walked. The combination of hypothermia and exhaustion should have caused organ failure within 24 hours. Schmidt had survived 72 hours. He had lost about 12 kilograms of body weight. His body had begun to consume its own muscle tissue for fuel. His heart showed signs of stress, normally associated with extreme endurance athletes, after days of continuous activity. But Schmidt was no athlete. He was a normal soldier who had done something that no medical textbook said was possible. Richter would later write a report on Schmidt's case. The report would fall into Soviet hands after the war, and would become part of a study on human resilience under extreme conditions. Decades later, sports medicine experts would study Schmidt's case, trying to understand how the human body can exceed its own limits when the will is strong enough. But that was all in the future. On March 9th, 1944, Schmidt only knew that he had succeeded. The Soviet offensive came as he had predicted. At 09:00, an estimated 400 T-34 tanks and 50,000 Soviet infantry rolled towards the German defensive lines around Kovel. But thanks to Schmidt's warning, the 291st Division was not surprised. 3 tank companies with 47 tanks, mostly Panzer IVs and a handful of Tigers, had taken up defensive positions. 2 artillery batteries with 24 80mm flak guns, the deadliest anti-tank weapons in the German military, were strategically positioned. The infantry had received additional bazookas and teller mines. It wasn't enough to stop the Soviet offensive. The overwhelming force was too great, but it was enough to slow it down, to channel it, to inflict higher casualties than the Soviets expected. The Battle of Kovel would last another 3 weeks. The town would eventually be encircled, but the German troops would break out, and over 30,000 men would escape, who would otherwise have been captured or killed. Military historians would later calculate that Schmidt's warning delayed the Soviet offensive by at least 48 hours. In those 48 hours, the German military evacuated critical supplies and withdrew additional troops, who would otherwise have been lost. The strategic value of a single warning, delivered by a man who should have been dead. Schmidt spent 6 weeks in the hospital. His amputation healed, but slowly. The sepsis had ravaged his body. He would never be fully healthy again, but he lived. And when Captain Dietrich visited him and personally awarded him the Iron Cross First Class and told him that his bravery had been nominated for the Knight's Cross, Schmidt wept, not from pride, from grief for Klaus Bauer, Otto Braun, and Werner Stein, his comrades, who had died, so that he could survive and warn them. "I only did what any of us would have done," Schmidt told Dietrich. Dietrich, a man who had served on the Eastern Front for 3 years and thought he had seen everything, shook his head. "No, Private First Class, what you did was extraordinary, and we will never forget it." The story of Hans Schmidt's 200-kilometer march spread through the 291st Division and beyond. It became one of those stories that soldiers told each other in the trenches. If Private First Class Schmidt could march 200 kilometers with a shattered leg, then they could endure their own hardships. It became a yardstick, a standard of camaraderie and duty that was something to achieve, but whose mere existence showed everyone what was possible, when the alternative was the death of your brothers. Schmidt survived the war with one leg, crutches, and memories that haunted him every night for 50 years. He returned to Bavaria, to the forests he had known before the war. He married, had 2 children, worked as an accountant because forestry work was impossible for a one-legged man. He rarely spoke about the war, but once a year, on March 9th, he made a trip to a small cemetery in his hometown, to 3 graves: Klaus Bauer, Otto Braun, Werner Stein. Their bodies had been recovered after the war. Schmidt would stand before each grave, lower his head, and remain silent for a few minutes. Then he would speak, quietly, only for them. He would tell them about his year, about his children, his life, the small joys and worries of normality, and he would thank them for marching with him on that night, hallucinations or ghosts or just his broken mind. But they were there, and they had brought him home. One last thing that Dr. Richter documented in his report, something he didn't fully understand. When Schmidt was first questioned after his rescue, completely coherent, he described how he had walked through the Soviet checkpoint. He described every detail perfectly: the 4 guards, their weapons, the officer who waved them through. He described the road, the landscape, even the time. 7:02 p.m., he said, late afternoon dusk. After the war, when Soviet and German archives were compared as part of historical research, historians found something interesting. There was indeed a Soviet checkpoint at the exact location Schmidt described, but according to Soviet records, that checkpoint had only been manned from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. on March 8th. By 2:30 p.m., it had been abandoned as the troops moved forward in preparation for the offensive, which meant that when Schmidt claimed to have passed through there at 7 p.m., there would have been no one there. Either Schmidt had misremembered the time, misremembered the location, or something very strange had happened. The historians preferred the first explanation. Schmidt, when asked about it decades later, just smiled, said that much of those 3 days was blurred in his memory, that he wasn't sure anymore what had been real and what was a fever dream. But privately, to his wife, Elizabeth, he said something different. "I know what I saw," he said. "The guards were there. I walked through them. Whether they were real or not, I don't know. But they let me through, and that's all that matters." These are the stories that are rarely told in big history books. No tank aces with 100 kills, no fighter pilots with iron crosses, just an ordinary soldier who did what was impossible, because the alternative was letting his comrades die. What Hans Schmidt demonstrated during those 3 days in March of 1944 wasn't superhuman strength. It was the opposite. It was the deepest, most fundamental humanity. The instinct that says the man next to you is more important than yourself, that you will endure anything, every pain, every impossibility, if it means your brothers get a chance to live. Modern militaries study tactics, strategy, technology. But the German military, with all its faults and the abhorrent regime it served, understood a truth that no technology can replace. Camaraderie is stronger than steel. Loyalty to the man next to you trumps every weapon. And sometimes a single soldier who refuses to give up wins battles in ways that no general staff can foresee. I'm telling you this story today for a reason. In an age where we are separated by screens, where community is something we simulate online instead of live. We need reminders of what real connection means. Schmidt didn't march 200 kilometers for an abstract concept, not for a regime, not for an ideology. He marched for Klaus, who told jokes that were never funny, but everyone laughed anyway. For Otto, who constantly talked about his motorcycle that he would buy after the war. For Werner, who was barely 19 and wrote letters to his mother every Sunday. For Captain Dietrich, Sergeant Zimmermann, Medic Richter, the machine gun squad, the men with whom he had shared cigarettes, dug trenches, and endured countless cold nights. That is what he marched for: faces, names, comrades. And when his body told him he couldn't go on, his mind replied, "But they're worth it. They are always worth it." This story is important. It must not be forgotten, because in a world that is increasingly atomized, where it's every man for himself, where loyalty seems old-fashioned and self-sacrifice naive, we need reminders that the opposite is true. The strongest moments in human history are not when individuals rise for themselves. They are when individuals fall for others and refuse to let them fall. If these stories matter to you, if you want these memories of genuine heroism preserved, then support this work with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every super thanks allows me to spend weeks in military archives, secure veteran interviews before the last witnesses disappear, and tell these stories in ways that honor the truth. These men did not die or suffer for clicks or attention. They did it for each other. The least we can do is ensure that their stories don't die with them. Schmidt survived until 1987. He died at the age of 67 from complications from his war wound. His leg never truly healed. The infection had caused permanent damage that weakened his system over decades. But he had gotten 43 years after that March of 1944, 43 years to see his children grow up, to know grandchildren, to sit in the Bavarian Alps that he had always loved, and find peace. At his funeral, 17 former soldiers of the 291st Infantry Division appeared. Old men now, in their 60s and 70s. They wore no uniforms, but as the casket was lowered, they stood together at attention. And Private First Class Ludwig Hartmann, the man who had first discovered Schmidt back in the German lines on March 9, 1944, stepped forward. From his pocket, he took a faded piece of paper. The original message that had been sent to division headquarters. Private First Class Schmidt reports massive Soviet offensive Kovel tomorrow. 400 tanks estimated. Recommend immediate reinforcement. Hartmann read it aloud. His voice broke at the word Comrades. Then he carefully folded it and laid it on the casket. For Klaus, Otto and Werner, he said, he brought you home. Now you're together. There wasn't a dry eye at the funeral. Not just among the veterans, but among the younger generations who had come to learn. Who wanted to understand what their grandfathers had gone through, what they had sacrificed, not for ideology, but for each other. Schmidt's story reminds us that war is the worst invention of mankind, but that in the worst of mankind, sometimes the best of mankind appears. Loyalty that transcends fear of death, courage that seeks no medals, love that is not romantic but deeper, the love of comrades who have seen hell together and refuse to leave each other there. There's one last thing, something Schmidt's wife Elizabeth only revealed after his death, under his bed, in a locked box he never opened while they were together. She found something. 3 letters, addressed to the families of Klaus Bauer, Otto Braun, and Werner Stein, written in the weeks after his march while he was recovering in the field hospital. Schmidt never sent them. He couldn't bring himself to do it. What do you say to a mother whose son died while you survived? How do you explain to a father that his boy bled out in the mud, but you're here, breathing? The letters were identical, short, painfully honest. "Your son died quickly," Schmidt wrote. "He felt no pain. His last thoughts were of home, of you. He was brave to the end." And then, at the end of each letter, a line that made Elizabeth cry 40 years later when she read them. "I live because he died. I will honor this gifted life, and every day, I promise." And he had 43 years, every single day, a gift, bought with the lives of his comrades, a gift he never took for granted, never forgot, never wasted. What impresses you most about Hans Schmidt's story? Is it the physical feat, marching 125 miles with a shattered leg? Is it the mental will that kept him going when his body had given up? Or is it the simple, fundamental fact that he never considered not trying? That for him, the question was, never, can I do this? But how can I not do this? Many of you have shared your own family stories. Grandfathers who were there, great-grandfathers who made similar marches, made similar sacrifices. These stories are important. They're the fabric of our shared history. Write in the comments below. What did you know about the men in your family who served? What did they tell you? What couldn't they tell you? Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. Every story counts, because these aren't just stories about war. They're stories about what people do when everything else falls away, when no officer is watching, when no medal awaits, when the only thing that matters is the man next to you. And in that moment, in that decision, we see who we really are. Schmidt saw and decided. They are worth it. Everything is worth it. And he was right.